Welcome back to part 3. I'm excited to finish this canvas and show with you the finished product. As you can see, there in its glory. Our first step will be continuing on, and we'll be starting with the sign. Here you can see the sign on the other canvas. This is rather a fun process. But first I need to clean up my mess, put away the texture paste, make sure my stencil's clean, the palette knife is clean. While this is water soluble, once it dries it's next to impossible to get it off. So due diligence with cleaning. So here's the chipboard piece, and I'm just using some chipboard letters and I'm gluing those onto this chipboard. Any chipboard piece will work. This particular one was cut from a Sizzix die, and the letters are some chipboard letters I had laying around. Now I'm going to use some Ranger foil tape. This foil is very thin. It has adhesive on the backing. Lay it down and size it. I need it big enough to wrap around onto the other side. So once I figure out how much of it I actually need, I'll be cutting it down, removing the adhesive, and then laying it over the top of this chipboard piece with the letters. Once I get it down and pat it into place to hold it, I'm just going to kind of work my way around using an embossing tool to outline all of these letters. I will be using an assortment of tools. Here is a stylus, fairly large, and I'm moving to a smaller stylus here. I've speeded this up. It's just going around and around. And now I'm going to use a Teflon bone folder to get in and form those sharp points. Once all of that is done, I'll be burnishing the foil onto the back side, making sure that everything is smooth and everything is laid down tightly. Now, the foil may crack, and you can lay in smaller pieces of foil to fill in those holes, or just plan on having the paint fill in the holes. Here I'm adding some texture, again with a smaller tip stylus, just going back and forth. I'm pushing rather hard. I'm denting into the foil, not enough to tear, but enough to put an impression. There's also an impression that will form in the chipboard as well. So here I'm going to now begin coloring. You can see how it's all been embossed. It's rather boring. So I'm going to use some alcohol inks. This particular one is gold, the metallic. The others were from the Verdi and from the metal coloring collection. This is blending solution, and I'm just dabbing this on. This process is layer upon layer of ink and Inca gold, rubbing paste, and you're just layering it to try to create aged. So I gave up putting it on the blending tool and just squirted it onto the sign. A little more here, a little there. And just sort of working it in, kind of imagining what aged metal or old wood would appear. And then blotting it off, moving my alcohol out of the way, and now I'm going to move on to Inca Gold. Here I'm using a bright gold, just rubbing it in. The gold will go down into the texture even a little better than the alcohol ink. We've got the alcohol ink underneath with the gold down into the texture and then buffing that off. Now I'm going to add some pewter, again buffing it in, and some silver. Checking to see if I have enough contrast. It's looking good, but not quite. So this is Rub and Buff in copper. I'm using that to try to increase that contrast between the base and the actual letters. Went back to the alcohol ink just to reinforce some of that underlying color. Spreading it out, buffing it out, and now I'm going back in with the gold again and laying that over the letters. Buffing it again. We're nearly done. This is looking pretty good. It dries almost instantly. You don't really need to seal it. I did not. All right, now we need to do something with these curlicues. The Steam texture paste has provided a background, and so I'm using liquid pearls to go over the center of those steam swirlies to provide a little bit more depth and a little bit more interest. Just following the lines of the curlicues. I am doing both layers. The first layer of texture paste that was laid down, and then the second. So now we're ready to distress the backdrop. Here I'm using some Irresistible texture spray and wedding dress. On the first canvas I sprayed it, and I had a bit of difficulty not getting it all over places that I didn't want it, and it's rather permanent. So I opted to use the sprayer and a paintbrush and splatter it onto the canvas. I wanted it kind of splotchy, so I'm hitting it with the paper towel, and I'm also removing it from the cups and the bean bag, and I'm just building this up. A little bit, dab, a little bit more, and dab. You'll notice that I hand lettered a C into the center of that cup. I just used a marker pen and just drew it in. Here I'm adding this texture paint to the whipped cream to further give that illusion of that whipped cream. This is a good example as to how all these layers are working together. The vellum gives us the rumpled texture. The watercolored pencil gives us the shadow. The sorbet gives us a little hint of shimmer, and then the white texture paint gives us the next detail. Now, using Beacon's 3-in-1 glue, I've applied glue to the edge of the plastic lid that was cut previous, and I'm attaching it to this cup. I tried on the previous one using glossy accents, and I had a hard time getting it to adhere, but this Beacon's grabbed right on and has held quite well. Applied some to the back of the latte and the flowers. This canvas is nearly coming to conclusion. The one thing that I did not show is that I used some Ranger Distress in walnut ink and just went around the edges of the canvas to give it a little more aged look. The final step is to color in those bubbles. So I'm using a brushable glue. This is really just a white glue that I've added a little bit of water to, and using the tip of my paintbrush, I'm putting circles on where that texture paste was in the very first step. And once I get this completely glued, I will be adding some Ranger Distress glitter in Picket Fence so that these little bubbles will have just a bit of glitter and shine. The end of the paintbrush works really well for this. It makes it easy to make those circles nice and round. This glue dries fairly slow, but it does hold the glitter quite well. So here I'm bringing in the Distress glitter and a small little spoon, and I'm just going to drop this over those glitter dots, and this will remain until that glue is completely dried. Usually I leave it overnight at this point. Some of the glue's a little bit thicker. There's other areas on the canvas itself that also are not quite dry. The beacons takes about 24 hours to completely cure. It's set quite a bit sooner, but it's not completely cured. And these canvases tend to take quite a beating, people bumping into them as they're hanging on the wall, so I wanted to make sure that everything was solid before I started moving this around. The final step that just sort of gave it that little bit extra is I used some Heidi Swapp gold spray, and I'm just spritzing it on just to give it that little subtle shimmer without it being too overwhelmed. And then, like I said, after all this was dried and knocked off, I just took a Distress ink pad and just went around the very edges of this canvas. And that has it completely finished. I hope you've enjoyed watching me make this canvas. I've thoroughly enjoyed making it. I hope you'll join me for my next video where I am going to use the same products and create a 3D card, or I should say a multi-medium card. Right. Thank you again, and have a latte.